Today's topic for our masterclass is a white still life. Very often, techniques like this are used where there are white still lifes, or still lifes in just one colour scheme, but there is a play with different shades of colour. And thanks to these colour variations, we achieve a certain effect. So, let's look at what we have. All the objects are in a similar colour scheme. Which object is the centre of the composition? Which one draws our attention first? Which object does our gaze stop on? Well, it's probably this jug right here. It's the largest and stands out the most. Even though it's not in the centre, it takes the central place in this composition. And at first we see it. Our first glance falls on it. So, despite being in the back, the jug is the focal point of the composition. Next, there's a small echo of it here. The eggs. So, the second point we look at is the jug, and then our gaze moves to the eggs. Notice the line along which our gaze moves. First, it falls on the jug, and then it moves along a diagonal like this arc. You can even trace this arc. See? These arcs, they're not perfectly straight lines, but curves. If all the objects were standing in a perfectly straight line, it wouldn't feel as pleasant. Curves are often more pleasing to the eye than sharp straight lines. This movement feels present in this still life, creating a curved flow. Now, let's look at how the objects are arranged on the page. There's a rule of thirds, which we'll discuss in more detail when we build a landscape, regarding how objects are positioned relative to each other. But for now, I want to point out the presence of the golden ratio. What is the golden ratio? You can find plenty of information about it online, with images like this one with a spiral shell, where each part of the spiral relates to the next part in a way that the sum of the previous two parts equals the next one. It's easier to understand when you read about it, but here, notice that each subsequent object in our arc is not exactly twice as big, but it's just a little bit bigger than half of the previous one. This gradual increase is what we see here. Now, let's return to the colour scheme. There's a certain alternation of warm and cold tones. Despite the fact that all the objects are predominantly white or light, there's one little yellow bowl here, which is still very light. And even though the jug is mostly cold-toned, the bowl is warm. So, the jug is primarily cold, and this bowl is warm, while the small bowl and the eggs is cold. This creates an alternating pattern. The warm bowl stands against a cold background, and vice versa. Each object is perceived with this contrast of warm and cold, adding another compositional technique. Next, notice that each object overlaps with the others. They don't sit right next to each other or in perfect alignment. For example, if we place the jug here, with one bowl here and another one right there, it would be considered a poor arrangement. It's much more effective when objects partially overlap. This way, our brain perceives depth in the composition. One object is placed behind the other, and it creates a sense of space. This makes the picture feel less flat and gives the impression of depth and movement, as if the space is receding behind the objects. Now, let's talk about balance. Let's take a look at why this egg has rolled off to the side. Imagine if it wasn't there. Notice how much duller our still life would be. This little egg actually balances out the entire composition. For example, if the egg were lying here, you'd see that the whole still life seems to tip over to this side. Why? Because, first of all, we have this little spout here that points in that direction, subtly guiding our gaze there. The movement of our gaze then continues, and our jug is slightly off-centre, shifting the balance to the left. This egg pulls the balance back and stabilises the composition, even though it's small. If it were larger, it wouldn't look as logical. It would seem too heavy. So there's a kind of lever rule at play here. The smaller the object, the further we can position it. Now let's review the compositional techniques we've used. The movement along the arc, balance between objects, objects positioned one behind the other, the alternating warm and cold colours, and, of course, the golden ratio. By the way, here's another point I wanted to bring to your attention. Sometimes this is overlooked, but the shadows of objects are also part of the composition. Here, the shadows all move to the left. It's logical that all the shadows go in one direction, and this too shifts the weight of the composition to the left. So, if we removed this egg, the entire composition would shift left because of the shadows. Okay, let's start with the drawing. I'm drawing on a square sheet of paper. If you have a rectangular sheet, I recommend placing it horizontally like this. There's more space horizontally, so you can expand the shadows in this direction. This composition would work better with the fields on the sides placed like this, rather than if they were here. Of course, it's possible to work with a vertical layout, but then you'll have to compress the composition a bit. Otherwise, you can see that the egg would feel cramped in the sheet, so you'd need to bring it closer. If the composition gets too compressed, it might lose its harmony. I recommend placing it horizontally, like this. Let's begin. First, let's mark the main shapes in our drawing. I really recommend not starting by outlining every figure because you might end up spending too much time on details. Let's mark where our objects will be. The jug is placed slightly below the horizon line. Next, there's a bowl. This bowl is taller and positioned higher, extending beyond the upper third of the composition. There's another smaller bowl here, and let's also mark where the eggs will be. Now you can already see how these shapes relate to each other. For example, this arrangement can be seen as the sum of these two figures, creating a progression that follows the golden ratio. Now, we move on to constructing our shapes. When sketching, you can also mark the shadows right away. This helps you visualize the composition and decide if you're happy with it. Without the shadows, it might look unclear, but with shadows you can see that the space is evenly distributed. There are no empty gaps, and the objects still have enough breathing room. We start by fitting the jug into our rectangular frame. The widest parts of the jug are the belly and the spout, which are about the same width. The narrower parts are the neck and the base. I'm not drawing the axis of symmetry for the jug. You can add it if you want, but sometimes the jug isn't perfectly symmetrical. In fact, the axis might even distract us. For example, this curve here is larger than the curve on the other side. If I added the axis, it might mislead me. Here's another important tip. Make sure the edge of the jug doesn't align perfectly with the corner of the page. Leave some space there. If needed, shift the jug slightly to the side to avoid this issue. Now, look at the handle of the jug. First, we can see the underside of the handle. Then, it curves behind the body of the jug, and finally we see the top side of the handle. This isn't a critical detail. If you simplify it with just a basic line or shape, it will still look fine. But I enjoy highlighting small details like these. There's also some rust on the jug, which adds a nice touch and makes it more interesting.
We did the right thing, but it didn't turn out that way. It's been heavy and we're starting to break, but I hope you'll be okay. There's little difference in the words that we say, 'cause we all want the same thing. The sun still rises in her usual way to welcome the new day. I don't feel it anymore, and I know I'm not the same.
Moving on to the bowl. Here you can draw the axis of symmetry. We go into more detail about constructing cylindrical objects in my course on drawing objects, where we cover perspective thoroughly. If you're struggling with this, feel free to message me, and I'll share some helpful materials. Even though part of the bowl is hidden behind another object, I still draw its full shape. This helps ensure accuracy and prevents distortions. When one object overlaps another, it's easy to accidentally make mistakes. So, drawing the full shape keeps everything aligned.
But I'm fading away. I'm staring out into a whole new space where I know I should feel safe. My heart is breaking and this look on my face shouldn't look.
For this bowl, I want to make it slightly wider. The opening is quite narrow since we're viewing it almost at eye level. Notice small imperfections, like a little chip on the edge of the bowl. These tiny details make the still life more interesting and give it character. I also mark reflections here. For example, there's a reflection from the bowl of eggs. I'll lower this egg slightly. It looks a bit stuck to the edge.
So much confusion in this theater of pain with the roles we all play. I'm standing up and I don't care what it takes. I don't care what they say. I keep staring at the floor and I'm tired of these games. I keep trying to be strong, but I'm fading away. I'll protect you as best as I can. That's the job of a family man.
This egg is larger because it's closer to us. This egg here looks like it's stuck to the surface. By the way, this egg is larger than the others, even though we see it as a circle because it's facing us with its rounded side. It appears bigger because it's closer to us than the eggs in the bowl. So, don't be afraid to make it noticeably larger.
I don't feel it anymore, and I know I'm not the same. I'll keep trying to put it on, but I'm fading away. I don't feel it anymore, and I know.
Oh, I almost forgot about the edges. Look at this bowl. Its opening is very clearly visible, especially where the edge curves outward. This gives it a round shape on one side, while the other side appears flatter. You can see how the edges of the bowl flare outward slightly, making it even more pronounced. Now, look at the shadows of this egg. The shadow here is wider than the shadow of this one, because of the way it's oriented. Since the egg is more elongated, its shadow spreads differently. Take a step back and look at your drawing from a distance. Think about whether everything is in the right place. Personally, I don't really like how this bowl looks. I think the edge here is a bit uneven. Always check your work. Take a photo of your drawing. Look at it again. Now we'll move on to colour. But before we start working with colour, I recommend doing a tonal value sketch. I won't comment much on mine because I want you to create your own. How do you create a tonal sketch? You determine the lightest parts of your still life and the darkest parts. This will help you transition to colour without getting lost or panicking about where to add shadows or highlights. Look at your reference photo or composition from a distance and evaluate it. Which part of the still life is the darkest? Which is the lightest? Think about how the tonal values relate to each other. For example, compare the jug and the shadow on this bowl. Are they about the same in terms of tone, or is one darker? Divide your still life into 3-4 tonal values. Identify the brightest white, a couple of mid-tones, e.g., one slightly darker and one slightly lighter, and the darkest areas. Compare how they relate to each other. Next, create a quick colour sketch. This is just practice. It's not about accuracy or detail. Focus on simplifying the shapes and blocking in the main colours. Look carefully to see where the warm and cool tones are and mark them. Once you've finished your tonal and colour sketches, we'll move on to working with colour. Now that we've completed the drawing, as well as the tonal and colour sketches, we can confidently move on to painting with colour. As I mentioned earlier, when working with white still lifes, or any monochrome compositions, it's all about playing with tonal values. These subtle contrasts are key. While the overall contrast is low, it's even more important to carefully select your colours. I'll be starting from the top and working my way down. I'll paint section by section, starting with this area, then moving to the jug and its handle, and then onto the eggs. For the larger areas, I'll work wet on wet first and then refine the details with glazing. Throughout, there will be a constant interplay between cool shadows and warm highlights. For example, this corner here will have a cold, greyish tone, so I'll mix blue to achieve that effect. First, I add shadows wet on wet using brown. Then, I'll adjust if needed, either lifting some colour or blending it out. This area here will have a slightly yellowish tone because there's some rust, which will reflect a bit. All these subtle pastel transitions need to be carefully conveyed. Here, the light is coming from this direction, so this section is the brightest and almost colourless. We'll leave it as is for now. Once it's dry, we'll add a fine line here for detail. We'll also add the rust later. For now, let's move on to the jug. The jug is the largest object in our composition, and it also has the biggest shadow, so I'll mix enough paint for the shadow first. The shadow will have several variations. Look here, this part will be cooler, leaning towards violet grey and fading into a bluish tone. There's also a yellow reflection on this side from the nearby bowl, and here the shadow will turn more blue. There's a very bright white stripe along the jug which we'll leave untouched. You can even outline it lightly with a pencil to avoid accidentally painting over it. This bright stripe needs to follow the shape of the jug. It's important for maintaining the form. I've mixed my shadow colours and now I'll add some yellowish tones to complement it. I start by wetting the area with clean water. I want to make sure this highlight stays very sharp and visible because it's a strong focal point in the photo. Remember, the jug's shadows are quite dark, so check if you've made them dark enough. Right now I can see that mine are still too light, and they'll lighten further as the paint dries. I'll intensify the shadows to compensate. While I wait for this to dry, I'll work on this area here. This shadow is warmer, and there's also a shadow cast by the handle. Another interesting detail. There's a small white gap here, like a reflective highlight. The shadow from the jug's handle curves slightly, and there's a bright highlight that will show with the background later. Now, I'll soften some of the edges slightly, but I'm not painting the rust yet. I'll add the rust later and apply it to all areas at once.
I keep trying to put it on, but I'm fading away. I'm fading away. I'm fading away.
Next, I'll paint the handle. Look closely at where the light and shadow fall. We'll leave the highlights as white and darken the shadowed areas. You can also soften the edges slightly so they're not too sharp. Even though most of the side of the handle is in shadow, the top part is cooler, with the lightest part of the shadow here. Towards the bottom, the shadow turns warmer. There's even a slight reflection. Something is reflecting onto the handle, adding an interesting tone. There's also a shadow under this small detail where the handle connects. I'll add a bit more shadow here to enhance the depth now that the area has dried. I'll darken it further with a glazing technique to increase the contrast.
I thought that we did the right thing, but it didn't turn out that way. It's been heavy and we're starting to break, but I hope you'll be okay.
Now let's move on to the rust and define its texture. To make it look natural, use a variety of colours, some darker, some more reddish. Use a fine brush to add details. On the darker side of the jug, you can add small specks and dots of rust. You can also mix in some ochre for variety. The goal is to create an uneven texture rather than a flat uniform spot. There's also rust on the small metal piece where the handle attaches. Pay attention to those details to make the composition more realistic. There's another interesting detail here. A small drip or streak. It adds a bit of character and life to the jug. I'll wait for this area to dry before erasing the pencil lines and refining the blue outline. In the meantime, let's move on to the bowl. Thank you for watching my tutorials. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment. It really helps support the channel and motivates me to create more interesting content for you. If you'd like to support the channel financially, you'll find ways to do so in the description below. You can also subscribe on Patreon to access more lessons that aren't yet available on YouTube. Additionally, you can sign up for group or individual lessons to receive personalised feedback on your work, techniques, and recommendations for improving your skills. Thanks again for watching. Let's continue with the video. Now, for the bowl, I'm using ochre as the base colour. If your ochre is very yellow like mine, you can mix in a little brown to tone it down. I'm applying the colour in a very diluted wash, filling the entire bowl in one tone. Later, I'll add shadows and details. While the paint is still wet, I'll lift a small highlight in this area. I accidentally touched the jug, so I'll clean that up as well. Here, the shadow on the bowl is quite brown, but it doesn't start directly at the edge. There's a bit of reflected light coming from the side. I'm not sure what it's reflecting, but I'll try to suggest it. Notice that the bowl's shadow has a soft reflection from the table surface. The part of the bowl closest to us is also in shadow, but it's a brighter, warmer shadow, not grey or dull. The colour transitions gradually becoming more vivid in some areas. These dried spots on the bowl are bothering me, so I'll try to smooth them out with another layer of paint.
'Cause we all want the same thing. The sun still rises in her usual way to welcome the new day. I don't feel it anymore, and I know I'm not the same. I'll keep trying to put it on, but I'm fading away. I'm staring out into a whole new space where I know I should feel safe.
Now let's move to the other bowl. Just like with the jug, this bowl will have shadows with cooler tones, greyish violet in some areas. There's also a yellowish reflection, possibly from the table or another object, and the bottom of the bowl has a bluish tone. Pay attention to the shadow under the rim of the bowl. There will always be a shadow there. In this case, the bowl's shadows are slightly lighter in tone compared to the jug.
Shouldn't look this way again. So much confusion in this theater of pain with the roles we all play. I'm standing up and I don't care what it
Now, let's talk about the eggs. Their shadows will have warm, yellowish tones that transition into soft browns. This creates a glowing effect, making the eggs appear luminous against the white background. It's important to note that the tonal transitions between objects are subtle. The jug, for instance, has the darkest tones, and none of the other objects' shadows should be darker than the jug's. Now that the paint on my jug has dried, I'll go back and refine some areas. The tones are mostly consistent, but I'll lighten this part a bit for contrast. At this stage, I focus on precision and control. I recommend erasing any remaining pencil lines, ensuring everything looks clean and polished. Why wait for the paint to dry before erasing? It makes it easier to keep your hand steady and avoid smudging or damaging the paper.
they say. I keep staring at the floor, and I'm tired of these games.
Finally, take a look at this curve on the rim of the bowl. It shows how the bowl recedes into the background, adding depth to the composition. Here, I'll add slightly more contrasting shadows to the eggs. As I mentioned earlier, they will have warm, brownish shadows with hints of yellow highlights. I'll also erase these pencil lines now. What's interesting about the eggs is the way the shadows appear. The table beneath them is white, but it's not a flat white. It's slightly glossy. This means it reflects some light, so the bottom parts of the eggs aren't completely in shadow. The light reflects here, and this lower area is also softly lit.
Be strong, but I'm fading away. I'll protect you as best as I can. That's the job of a family man.
Now, regarding the shadows, I think we're almost done. As we've mentioned before, the jug has the darkest shadows. When working with shadows, always remember to include reflections. The shadows here are quite warm, not cool. The light is white, and reflections are essential. What are reflections? Imagine light hitting an object. Just like the moon reflects sunlight, objects also reflect light, which then bounces into the shadow areas. That's why the darkest part of the shadow is directly under the object, followed by a reflection, and then the shadow gradually becomes lighter. This applies to all the objects. Shadows aren't just a flat, uniform grey. They have gradients with reflections creating slightly lighter areas within them. Here, I'll add a bit more shadow to emphasise this. You can see how the shadow softens and lightens towards the edge. It's the same with all the shadows. They're all interconnected and consistent in tone. Another detail I want to show is how the shadows transition into the background. For example, on the wall here, the shadow shifts to a bluish tone. As the sunlight moves, it becomes more noticeable. Besides shadows, there are faint reflections on the table. They have a very subtle ochre or brownish tone. Start by lightly marking the table colour. It has a slightly yellowish tint, especially in this area. Once you add that, the eggs seem to glow against the surface, creating a beautiful effect. This demonstrates how subtle tonal variations can create such a play of light and shadow. It's especially important to understand this when working on a white still life, where tonal precision is key. Here, the white transitions softly because the light is coming from this direction and moving downward. This side is more illuminated, while this part is in shadow. Now, I want to show you some very faint shadows. These are almost invisible, but they still play an important role. You might not consciously notice them, but they add complexity to the composition. It's as if there's another light source subtly affecting the scene. These shadows weren't obvious to me at first either, but once I saw them, they added so much to the overall effect. For example, the bowl has a faint yellow reflection on the table. It's very subtle, almost like a fraction of a tone. You can add just a tiny bit of colour here, and it already makes a difference. This side of the bowl also needs to be darkened slightly. It should have a more greyish tone. Start with a gradient from the top, blending around the handle to emphasise its volume. We can't define this volume with white alone, so shading is necessary. Since the light source is coming from this direction, this side of the bowl is in shadow. I can see that the shadow here is too faint. It's almost disappeared. I'll add more shadow now. Starting from the top, I'll carefully leave a small white highlight to keep the area luminous. Notice how just a touch of colour enhances the handle, making it glow. Once everything is dry, you can erase any remaining pencil lines. Step back and look at your work from a distance to check the overall composition. Bandage the jug looks great. It's so dimensional and detailed. The rust and tiny imperfections really add to the composition. The eggs also look wonderful. Be careful not to overpaint or smudge, keeping the eggs neat and smooth. Enjoy the process of painting and experimenting with colours. See you next time. Goodbye.